Hi everyone, and welcome to week 2 of our online UWC course on global citizenship. So our today's lecture will be on the topic of identity in the complex world in which we live. And today you will hear from me trying to define what identity is and in this way help you a little bit with the assignment. And also with me we have Alysa Baylor who will share her take and discuss with me the views that we have on the topic of identity. So before I introduce myself, maybe let's hear a quick introduction from Alyssa. So could you maybe talk a little bit more about where you're from and what your experience has been to date?
Sure, Hannah. Hi, everyone. So my name is Alyssa. I'm originally from the United States, from New York. I'm a teacher by profession. I've taught high school and middle school, specifically around writing and communications, and a little bit of college preparatory. But currently I work for a founding university called African Leadership University. We're based in Mauritius. It's our first year, and I am a curriculum designer and facilitator for a course called Communicating for Impact. Essentially, I designed a course for first-year students that is meant to prepare them for writing, communications, and storytelling and presentation skills. So yeah, I mostly serve a Pan-African community, a group of students who are about 60 right now, who are currently from 20 different countries across the continent. So yeah, that's a bit of my background and what I'm currently involved in. I'm really excited to be here. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Alyssa, for joining us tonight. So my name is Hanna Celina, and I am the founder of Online UWC, which we founded about 1.5 years ago and ran our first courses on the topic of sustainable development. This is our first on global citizenship, and so far it's been absolutely incredible, so thank you for everything. And before we actually launch into the topic of identity, I wanted to explain to you a few things about Online UWC. So first of all, thank you for an incredible week 1 of the course. I have personally learned a ton from all of your blog posts and the discussions that took place over Hangouts. And I just wanted to tell you that what really makes this course different for me is that we try to give you as much freedom and responsibility for your own learning as you would like. This is why at times it may feel a little bit chaotic, but this is so by design. So please always try to contribute as much as you can, share your own resources, comment on the work of your peers, because honestly, we're all here for you, and we will always try to help you out with everything, but you also have all of your classmates who also will definitely try to help you out with everything. We really are more of a community of learners than we are of just a standard classroom. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing, I wanted to hint a little bit about what's going to be happening in future weeks, because while we're all here to learn, the learning is really action-oriented. So our objective here is to really empower you as activists and empower you as global citizens. So with that in mind, we will be working on a community project, and you will be hearing more about this during our email that we'll send out on Sunday, and we'll do more of this in week 4. So stay tuned. All right, so with this in mind, I have a quick presentation that I have prepared for you. And also to remember that you can ask any questions in the Q&A tool, and we will go through these questions, and both you can ask questions to Alyssa or to me or to both of us, and we will rotate with the responses. Okay, so let me screen share. the presentation. Great. And here we are. So right now, this is your task for the week, for the weekly discussion, is to come up with a definition of what identity means to you. And specifically, we'll be looking for a more sociology-based definition. So it will have to have some components of self-identity, and it will have to have some components of group affiliations. So I wish you the best of luck, because I personally find the definition that comes up as the #1 search result in Wikipedia is not necessarily a very complete definition. So I wonder how in your groups you will be able to come up with one sentence that describes to you what identity is in this context of global citizenship. So before we really launch into understanding the different axes of identity, I would like for you to kind of take a step back for a moment and imagine what identity would look like 30,000 years ago. So why this image here? So this is actually an incredible image from Taverne du Pont d'Arc in France. This is a drawing which was done by humans 30,000 years ago. And it was very powerful because you can see the similarity, the sensitivity of a modern human being in a human being in times where there were no states, there were no nations. We know almost nothing about their history. So when you try to define this concept of identity, try to think, if you ask this question to someone who lives 30,000 years ago, how would they define who they are? How would they define their own personal identity, and how would they define their group identity? Would they say that they belong to a specific tribe? Would they say that they belong to a specific cult? I really don't know very much about this era, but I definitely know that they would not call themselves French back in the day. So now let's move a little bit forward in time, because that's another interesting example. So let's move back 2,000 years ago. So this is a wonderful map. It's wonderful for two reasons. One is that it shows the Roman Empire. So this was the biggest that the Roman Empire ever got. And then I noticed on the map when I was looking at it that Sarmatia, that actually is where today's Poland and Eastern Europe is. It's actually noted as one consistent area, which is also extremely interesting, because looking at this map of Roman Empire, which is where some see the beginning of this European identity and of this European heritage, and of this generally like maybe Mediterranean, so not even just European, but this Mediterranean identity is back in the times of Roman Empire. The identity of Romans at that time would have been very different. So if you went into Egypt, if you went into Libya, if you went into Great Britain at the time, in all of these places, the levels in which people, I don't think actually anyone at that time would define themselves as Romans, apart from the people who actually came from the Roman Empire to defend these lands. So it's actually quite interesting that what's considered the beginning of this whole project is also a very non-defined national, regional identity. And then also imagine identity not so long ago. So about 100 years ago, not exactly 100, but in 1918, an interesting thing happened, and if you know who this person is on this image, which you probably don't, but that's you'll know the name, but probably not the face. This is Woodrow Wilson. In 1918, on January the 8th, he made a very famous speech called the 14 Points, which by many is seen as a starting point of a lot of nationalist conflicts in Europe, because he stipulated that any future, because 100 years ago Europe was still in the middle of a war, the First World War. And one of the points on that list of 14 points had to do with self-determination of states. So Woodrow Wilson, the American president, was actually calling for a redefinition of borders on the European continent based on the concept of national identity. And very quickly we realized that this was a little bit more complex than he had foreseen, and that not everyone saw national borders and the borders of identity of this group affiliation in the same places. And then another take on identity, because I also don't want to make it seem that we went from this kind of tribal to then regional or country identity to this global identity today. But because you still have very strong nationalism in one place, you may still have very strong tribe or city or smaller sub-part of a nation identity in other places. So it's not like, it all disappeared. But this is, for me, one of the most impressive things that we noticed just last year. So there was a very powerful earthquake in Nepal that resulted in terrible human loss and also in loss of wealth, property, security, homes of a lot of people in Nepal. And what's incredible was the international appeal and the international response of the global community to help the people of Nepal. So the image that you can see here is all the successfully funded campaign on Kickstarter, where people from all over the world were willing to support people living in Nepal through a variety of different funding initiatives. So now I just wanted to say, because obviously you have already started at least thinking about identity by looking at this identity flower and really figuring out where do you stand there and what kind of ways you can even start thinking about defining yourself. So here I picked a few categories where I wouldn't necessarily, resoundingly put myself as this is I identify as all of these things and feel, and what does it even mean to identify? I sometimes it gets more complicated. Some of them get more complicated than others, but let's just go through it. First of all, it's just a list of symbols, and you all probably know at least two or three of them. But the first symbol that we show is the fact that I'm a woman, so that's one element of my gender identity. The other one is a symbol of my city in Poland. So then another axis through which you can consider your identity. Then you can see the emblem of my country, Poland. So yet another symbol, another group with which I do have a formal affiliation through my nationality. Then finally the symbol of the European Union. And the symbol of the globe, which is global citizenship. So, what does belonging and what does identifying with all of these actually mean? What does it mean, especially I think that things like nationality get really complicated at times. So what if you move around a lot? And like in my case, I have moved away from Poland about 13 years ago. and at this point don't really have an intention to come back. So does this mean that is the fact that I identify as a Polish person, is it based on the sense of culture that has been communicated to me, or should it be something that's defined by a passport that I currently have? What will happen? How will your perception of my identity change if I change my passport and get a citizenship of another country? Another interesting thing is gender. I know, and this is something pretty incredible about the United States, is that there is always a battle at colleges to provide unisex toilets. So what this means is having a bathroom that's not going to be male or female, but any members of any gender can go in. And at first I didn't really understand what is the purpose until you really start thinking that for some people the act of defining your gender is actually a source of conflict, of internal conflict. So this is as a way of just being more understanding towards that. So all of these elements, I only shown parts of identity here, but there's many other ways in which you can have a group affiliation, and the most obvious of the ones that I left out is probably religious or ethnicity-based affiliation, which I don't particularly feel either of those. So and actually I don't probably feel a lot of the ones that I listed here, but I just chose to leave those out. And then finally, the exercise that we're asking for you to complete today is to provide an image that corresponds to your personal identity. So I just wanted to share an example of how wild you can go with it, because believe it or not, but this image specifically for me represents who I am as a person, and that category in which I'm willing to put myself as a person is actually artist, and this refers to the style of Jackson Pollock, where he always keeps a perfect balance of elements to their background, and that balance makes it very his paintings very convincing, and he's my favorite painter of all times. So let's now start the actual debate, and I'm going to stop presenting very soon and ask you for inputs, because one of the most important reasons why we talk about identity in this course, so there's two. So one is like the dark side of identity, is that if you define yourself as something, or if you define yourself as not something, there's always this concept of being in some element of identity or outside of some sort of identity, and this frequently can lead to conflict in terms if in case of like in after the 14-point speech, people disagree on what is in and what is out, and this can result in redefinition of borders. But then also another consequence, a positive consequence of identity, is the diversity of points of view and the diversity of cultures, and the continuation of amazing cultures. So even if I don't necessarily feel particularly proud of being Polish, and it doesn't make me want to fight for my country, at the same time I'm extremely happy to have grown up in a Polish family and share a lot of the customs of wonderful days that I have spent at home. So I guess from this I would like to stop presenting and come back to the main conversation. So Alyssa, are you still with us?
I am. Thank you for that. I think the part that was most intriguing for me was the consequences of identity. So you talked about choosing an identity that for you was most self-affirming, and to you made the most sense with your personal identity. So regardless of the group, the identities that come from group affiliations, the idea that one can self-identify or can take a certain amount of autonomy in defining oneself is an interesting notion, and I think may not be a universal one, where folks feel that that there may be societies or groups of people where they feel that actually the most pressing part of my identity is defined by the community I come from, and that it's not necessarily so straightforward that you can self-select an identity. I think that might be an interesting way to think about, does everyone have the right to self-identify?
That's a very, very interesting concept. And I actually had this discussion yesterday because I realized while trying to define who am I, what is my identity, what am I willing to identify as, I realized there's always this tension between you as an individual and you as a community of individuals. And as an individualist, I always try to pull away from any group identity because I find that very alienating. But it's interesting that you actually asked the question, is it possible to choose your identity, or do other people get to choose it for you? So definitely an open question, that one. I see that we have actually quite a few questions from the students who are watching this. So let me give you the first one. So people, it's from Babini. People portray themselves as different from what they actually are. Why do we change identities? If we like an element of somebody's identity and we absorb those qualities into us, does our own perception of ourselves change? Or do we lose our uniqueness? So that's a whole other question of what can identity change, and what happens if it changes.
Right. I think that's interesting. There actually seems to be two parts of this question. Can people portray themselves as different from they actually are? I think that's a different point than why do we change identities. I mean, in some ways, can anyone say that the identity I expressed at 13 is the same identity that I'm going to express at 18, at 25, at 45? And would that even make sense to make that sort of supposition? I would think that there are events in your life or people you meet or experiences that you have that contribute to a very forming and dynamic identity that changes just as you're changing physically. It changes with you, and that doesn't mean that it's no longer you. It just means it's a more dynamic you. It's not a static thing that someone can write in stone at any certain point in your life, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I definitely think that it makes sense. The other question that we have here is more related. That's quite interesting. So the social group that we hang out with, it is always necessarily related to the genes of our identities. Do the social groups form themselves always by identities, by similar identities, or do you think you cannot have groups with totally different personal identities? And I think this actually is a very interesting component about why do these group identities form. Because, well, I'll let you take this, and then I can continue my thoughts.
No, I'd like to hear your thoughts, and we can just kind of converse back and forth.
Sure. Sounds good. So one of the reasons why groups form is for people to accomplish the same objective. So if your objective is to provide peace and plenty in the land in which people of similar cultural origin live, and allow security of this land, then you form the myth of national identity. You form a special system that will define, how people, like, basically you create borders around your country and around your group of people who you want to include, and then you strategize together to optimize just for this one group of insiders. So I think that, in that specific example of how, like, a national identity would form, it's you can have groups that are identity groups, but that are actually extremely large groups that probably have different subgroups of sub-identities that can be extremely different from one another. But what defines that group is different to another group that around that axis of interest, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense, that you form groups around a common interest. That's probably one way that they form. And perhaps also groups form in response to certain power structures within the society. So if one group forms because of a common political aim or a common community building aim, that likely alternative groups will form, subordinate groups will form, perhaps people who feel alienated or disenfranchised. They will then somehow develop a collective identity around that disenfranchisement, and then that becomes sort of a periphery or a subordinate group that operates within the dominant structure. If that makes sense. I mean, I'm talking abstractly, but you can see how it can apply to sort of multiple contexts.
Yeah. What I find very interesting about this question is also the fact that there's this concept of the genes of our identities. So our identity is something, being embedded into us, and that's also extremely interesting, because sometimes you don't really think about the identity, as in, you broaden this point of view that sometimes you don't get to pick what other people perceive you as. So you get put in a group whether or not you choose to. So for example, if let's say you have someone with a huge mohawk, like a punk, hairstyle, goes into a shop, like, whether or not he likes being perceived as someone from this punk culture, he will be seen in this way, even if maybe it was a fashion statement completely unrelated to punk culture. And it doesn't really matter whether this person is Prince William of United Kingdom or or a commoner. Everyone will make a specific assumption based on this element of what they look like. So, and also, I guess, some elements you can change, but it takes a lot of work, I guess.
I hear you, Hanna. I think my thinking, though, was a little bit different, and when I was commenting on students not being able to choose, it was more from a thinking about my own students, and how for many of them thinking about identity individualistically doesn't make sense, that they often define themselves based on the tribe that they come from, or the community that they come from, the family structure, whether that be ethnicity or language. So in some ways they don't make sense on their own, but being a part of that community makes sense, and that's an inherited part of their identity, right? So that's it's not self-selected, it's something they've inherited and something that they do proudly often enough. That's more so kind of what I was hinting at before.
That's Definitely, like I would like to actually explore further why is it that some people might observe it in terms or might relate to identity in terms of define it in terms of a group or define it in terms of their individual attributes. So potentially that's also something we can explore in the assignment. So here I have another question, very popular one. What do you think of the humanities programs in the liberal arts US colleges that concentrate on topics such as identity, gender, race, ethnicity, instead of what the asker calls the major curriculum?
It's a brilliant question, I think. Well, I mean, I guess maybe because I'm from the U.S. and I went to one of these quote unquote liberal arts colleges. I actually studied international relations, and most international studies programs in the States focus on region. Usually, you're either Asian studies or European studies or your African studies. They force you into a box of focusing on a specific region or language or country or region or nationality. But in the college that I went to, we focused more on thinking about trends across cultures along these very markers of identity. So we focused on thinking about gender, race, ethnicity in different contexts across the globe, thinking transnationally. How do different communities express gender, race? How do they fight battles or negotiate between different impressions of themselves in different contexts? So I think it's a way to analyze the very concept of identity markers such as race and gender and ethnicity, but it's also a way to think more holistically outside of the common frameworks that we're used to. So outside of the archetypes of nationality and the common boxes we put ourselves in, are there ways to think across these boundaries? And I think when you talk about global citizenship, practicing those skills of analysis, of thinking more holistically, can be very powerful. I think it's one of the reasons I'm able to confidently engage in this topic is because I've had some practice in thinking along these lines.
So how does it actually practically help you look at the world and look at the problems that we have through this lens of gender and race and ethnicity, and actually propose some actionable solutions? Do you remember like any specific case that you found this lens interesting to help you address any issues?
Sure. I mean, so I part of my work and my thinking as an educator is how can education be a be a force of transformative change and in different communities. And so when I think along identity, gender, race, ethnicity in different contexts, I'm thinking about, okay, can I look at an educational program in a rural village in Latin America and compare it to an education program in Nairobi, Kenya, right? Can I think about these two programs that are supposed to be helping young people create positive change in their communities? Can I think about them? How can I compare them in a feasible, intelligent, practical way? And I often think about, well, are these two programs helping people of a certain identity or a certain demographic? Are these two programs addressing a specific ethnic group? And in what case are those two programs specific to the context of that community? And what is it about these programs that are effective, and what are maybe not so effective, and the whys or why nots? I think if you simply say, oh, these are two education programs, oh, these are two programs that help poor people or that help disenfranchised community, you miss a lot of the nuances, and you really do miss the impactfulness of these programs. I think we can glean a lot of insight if we think more complexly about the way people operate and the way people's identity and gender and race shape their experience.
So,
Um,
so do you think specifically, because this is something that I have been thinking about. Like, I think it was only when I went to United World College that I fully realized to what an extent my education in Poland was shaped through the fact that I was learning in Poland. So, for example, the reason why I was so excited to show you this map of Roman Empire and Sarmatia, the Eastern European megaland, is because in the myth of Polish identity, one of the things that's very powerful in the rhetorics in history and in literature actually is the conversation about how Poland was the greatest power in Europe at a time in 17th century, and how everything just went downhill from there. And this is a part of history that probably not very many people who have received education of 20th century history would know very much about. And in fact, most of my history education was focused on that era and with kind of this in mind. So do you think that there is a point to have national education reflect those national sensitivities, or should we go towards more global approach where you confront two different views of history, especially events where different countries disagree with what actually happened?
I think it's probably a step in the right direction if history reflects not just the story of that particular nation, but if it looks at something more holistically. So I've kind of had the experience of talking to educators who have taught history in a more holistic way, or thinking about what is the economic angle of the story, what is the social angle, what is the the sort of environmental story of this issue. So I would love to see a day where history, or an event, that history isn't just confined to an event like a war, or the rise of power of one individual, but if history is told through a story that has multiple angles and multiple perspectives, not just country versus country, but um, different ways of interpreting history. So, like a social sciences perspective, an environmental perspective, an economics point of view. So, if we could tell the same story, but through multiple lenses, I think that would be sort of the right direction, because that's actually how things happen, right? Like, you wouldn't tell the story of World War II just from one country's perspective. You would tell how it had a global impact on the economics of people, on the depression that occurred afterward, on the lives of different groups that were permanently dispersed. You would tell a more transnational picture of what happened as a result of that war. So
Yes, yes.
yeah.
I definitely point, but I think that in World War II, now I have an echo.
No,
Quite a few people actually, quite a lot of countries actually agree what has happened. There was a terrible tyrant, and he went on to a crazy war, and fortunately, the forces of good won. But what would happen if this tyrant actually won the war? How would this history be told in the books written by the other side? And that's, in that specific case, it's extremely terrifying. But, there's lots of historical events like the Armenian genocide and Turkish point of view on this, not a genocide. There's lots of issues that it would be, because they're so ingrained in parts of national identity, it would make it extremely difficult to tell the story in another way without breaking away from this, from the national identity, I guess, what it means to be Turkish or what it means to be Armenian. And it's difficult to retell that story differently.
Yeah, I hear you, and I think what we're now shifting toward or touching on is sort of the sub agenda, like the hidden agenda of education. And for a long time, countries saw education as being the way to develop, informed, productive citizens. They saw it as a way to sort of instill a sense of national pride in the next generation, and that's still very much the way most governments and national economies think about education. But in order for that to change, we have to think about education as a way of developing global citizens. And until we do that, it will always be about the agenda of the government or the agenda of that nation state before developing global citizens. Does that make sense? I think.
Yeah, yeah, no, it does, and it actually really resonates very well with what I have been reading in the ideas for change and for driving change that came out of the this class, so the global citizenship class, and actually also the sustainable development one. That a lot of the students want to share this global perspective with their local communities, with their schools, with their countries, with their cities, and I think it really is amazing to also see this happening kind of bottom up and not necessarily top down, because as you mentioned, countries don't necessarily have an incentive to change telling the story. Sorry, I feel like we got on this topic. I hope the viewers find it interesting, but I also see that there's a lot of great questions coming up. So let me change the question. Very interesting question. So what happens if you start faking parts of your identity and you do it for a very long time? Can it actually become part of your real identity?
Sort of like a fake it till you make it kind of question.
Yes, and just my personal take on this immediately made me think of how I acquired my American accent, because I lived in the US for 6 years. So fake it till you make it all the way. but what's your take on it? As an American living elsewhere, or in general, do you think it's possible to fake an identity, and does this identity become you? Is it something that you can almost teach yourself to be?
I suppose so, but I guess I'm wondering, what do you mean by faking? Is it like you're just immersing yourself in another culture? Is it like if you're immersing yourself in another culture and you maybe take on the mannerisms and the traditions, and maybe you take on, I don't know, the habits of that community, and then over time it just kind of feels like you're one of them, or you seem to have integrated successfully? Yeah, I don't know if that's faking though. Again, I think this goes back to my comments about identity being dynamic and it growing over time depending on your experiences. This question makes me think this person is, if you're saying faking, it's very like inauthentic and forced. But if it's just you growing or you adapting to the environment, why not? Yeah, it's definitely part of your reality eventually.
And also I think that this question really shows this kind of conflict, because we talked about conflict externally, you versus others or groups versus one another, but this question really points out to another conflict that happens due to identity, which is the internal conflict. Because as someone who has lived in many different countries and as someone who dreams in at least 3 different foreign languages, it's a conflict. It's you feel like you're faking it no matter what you do, no matter where you go, no matter which language you're in, you're always faking it, because you're not, it's not very simple. You need to adjust, you need to make these changes, and it's not always very clear whether it's the real you or it's the you trying to fit in. So in this way, again, is it a choice? Is it something that's internal, or is this something that is shaped by your environment? And that actually brings me to another great question, which I'm going to let you take because it's very difficult. How do you think the environment, place, people, mentality of the people, and other factors affect our identity? Do you think they affect us at all? And do you think we grow up building our identity based on these factors?
How do you think the environment, people, mentality, and other factors?
People, place, everything. So, are we born tabula rasa, blank page, and then it's the environment that shapes us, or do you think there's elements of identity that have been pre-written in us? I think that's broadly the philosophical concept. And then also, I think that it really connects to the question we were just discussing, which is that internal conflict of who you think you are and who you think it's better for you to be given your environment.
Yeah, I think like you said, philosophy has dealt with this question for a long time. It's the nurture versus nature argument. But I think, just from my experience, is just the very way we would go about answering this question is dependent on different groups of people in different contexts. I think my students have taught me that the answers to these questions are not universal, and that a lot of my assumptions around, that identity is something you self-elect or something that's a personal choice. I've been challenged on that, and I think more and more I'm coming to understand that some people really do define themselves by the community they come from, and therefore the environment has shaped them. Perhaps the single greatest force that has affected their identity or the shaping of their identity is the environment they come from. Not that that's a static thing, not that that's something that's written in stone. It just, at this moment in time, I think environment probably is the single greatest force, shaping force on identity. But as you grow, you can change your environment. As you grow, you can expose yourself to more, and absolutely, your identity then becomes a result of a combination of things, both your environment and your own choices.
So environment and choices. So that's quite interesting. So I think that we're starting to get really to the bottom of it, which is, you and your choices, the internal identity and your community around you, which is this external forces, this group affiliation thing, which was actually mentioned in that original definition. Now here is a great question which I really want to ask and answer, even though it's also very hard. So identity flower. We asked the students to consider their identity and their privilege through the concept of the identity flower. So speaking of powerful identity characteristics in the identity flower, they make us define our identity using a social evaluation of contrasts or conflict. So although social context influences our experiences, is it obligatory in order to have an identity?
I'm afraid I may not get this question completely, since I'm not familiar with the identity flower.
Yeah, well, I think that the identity flower, there's many different variation of the identity flower, but basically it has many different leaves that kind of spread from it, and you can have things, many different things on the axis, but you can have gender identity, sexuality, physical ability, political views, ethno-cultural background, education, and socioeconomic status. So I think that the interesting component here that Irene, who asked this question, is referring to is this, I guess, the powerful identity. It really makes you figure out your place in the society, in the not only just society, kind of you assume everyone is the same, but it shows you like a different powerful and less powerful elements, because the whole point of the identity flower, I believe, is to really see where you are in the point of privilege, to really understand your position, not just through your identity, but also through this social evaluation of contrasts.
Interesting. Can you give me an example of one of those contrasts?
Let me try. Well, let's. I think that the physical ability could be a good example, actually. That so for example, basically whether you're privileged or underprivileged. So as a person without any disabilities, you are fully fully privileged in the community. You do not suffer from any discrimination. You do not suffer from anything. Yep, here's an example of an identity flower. Let me present this. And then if you are if you do have a disability, you might actually suffer from some level of discrimination. So I think that the question here is can you almost defy where technically speaking you could be based on your ability or disability? Can you challenge this, and can you have an identity that doesn't necessarily follow these power rules? That's how I understand this question. Maybe I'm over complexifying it.
Okay, so now I think I'm clear on the social evaluation of contrast point. Although social content influence our experiences, is it obligatory in order to have an identity? So understanding your identity within these different contrasts, do you have to understand, is that the only way to understand identity, or can there be other ways?
Yeah.
Perhaps. Okay. Yes, I suppose I did a similar activity with my students. It's funny enough, we started our school year off this way as well, thinking about identity and having them plot, what is their most salient identity factor among, just as the flower had these different components. And often students, a good significant number of students, picked other because they felt like these markers or these contrasts don't quite point to the most salient parts of their identity. I think similar to how you identified as artists, which is not a typical identity marker that people would usually choose or even offer as an option. I think sometimes there are those who are a bit alienated or feel a bit alienated because these markers don't reflect either their experience or the way they think about themselves. So I think it's possible, but I also think we must be honest with ourselves and remember that so much of our experience as human beings is dictated by structures of power and things that already exist outside of ourselves, and that we operate within those power dynamics. So while there is certainly a level of agency and for you to choose who you are, there is a certain amount of conformity to certain realities, I think. And I can probably talk about this most concretely. I think race is sometimes a lived reality for folks. To be Black or to be white or to be Asian, you live within that very visible reality of yourself. And whether or not you feel like that is the most salient part of your identity, being Black or white, or however you define race, you don't have necessarily a lot of choice because of the nature of how race is perceived by our community. If that makes sense.
It does. It does make sense. Unfortunately, while it makes sense, I would love to challenge it because, we talk about this transformational education, and we already spoke in one way about, moving away from national education to international education, global citizenship education. I would say that with a lot of these things about identity, where we as human beings, it's so interesting that you say that actually a lot of people identify as other and not on these traditional markers. I'm really interested to see what's actually going to come out of this exercise that we're doing in this class, because I don't know. I really want to see what the students think about it. But so as individuals, people just refuse to use those markers to define themselves, but at the same time, we still use them as proxies to operate as a community. So is it therefore not something that we can just change by bringing to awareness the fact that nobody really wants to wants to use it anymore. And again, I'm not saying that this is something that's possible in the short term, because it's a habit, it's a stereotype. But I think that if it is something that we can continue challenging as an inaccurate way to describe people, because people may not want to refer to themselves in these terms, then maybe it is something that can change in the long term. What do you think?
I think so. I think there's more to the identity marker than just meets the eye. So, for example, race. If I could be just sort of make some general statements about it, that people who perhaps share the same race may share also the same history or the same ethnicity, and therefore identifying as that race is important to that community because of the common history that they share. And so it's not so easy to say that we no longer want to identify as being Black. It's more so that we don't necessarily want to cast off a history that is shared amongst a group of people and therefore defines as part of our identity. And I'm not speaking for any one group. I'm just saying that often these identity markers have more to do with something else that's associated with it, or that's a binding force, than just the identity itself. Even just if we could pick another example, gender perhaps. It has less to do with being defined by the way you express your gender identity or the way you express your sexual orientation, and more to do with what community is there around being a woman, or what community is available to me around being a part of that gender identity.
This is a beautiful example.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason I think that this example is so beautiful is because I really do not like being identified as woman. And this has nothing to do with, just, I feel like I am a woman, that's fine, but like, leave it alone. Let it be. It has nothing to do with my work performance. I don't want to have special woman session. I don't want to have special woman community. I really prefer to interact in groups that are not divided by the gender, because I feel like I have as much in common with men as I have with other women. And it's so for me, and maybe because I'm so willing to really argue over this one, is because I went to a women's college for 1 year. So before I transferred to Harvard, I was actually at Wellesley College, which is a women-only college, and I was faced with a very strong feminist identity and woman identity and woman community that I really had a very hard time adjusting to, because it was really not how I wanted to interact in the context of this identity marker. So this was an incredibly interesting example for me to, some people want to identify as women, and other just not very important part of my identity. I don't want for people to emphasize it in who I am, because for me it makes no difference.
No, I think that's probably an experience that a lot of people face when groups try to form around specific identity markers, right? So if you try to force people to engage with only one part of their identity, it doesn't make sense. And I think that's okay, right? That there are parts of our identity that are more salient, and therefore you may want to be around other people like that, and you may want to identify with people of a particular gender or race or ethnicity, and that's fine. But what I don't think is realistic in a way is to say that we should just discard them, or that we should move away from them without considering all the implications of why those identity markers exist and why people tend to group around them and form communities around them. I think, again, there's just more at play than just people wanting to be a part of a clique or a part of a
Completely agree with you. Just before, because our time is up, and the students have been very patiently staying with us throughout the lecture. But I wanted to kind of close off, share this question slash manifesto from Hanna. So, if we all, as human beings, emerge as one of Homo sapiens without any borders, then what's the point of the existence of nations? What's the point of being a patriot if our nation consists of descendants who arrived at our area about 200 years ago? And so you know that's a really interesting question to pose in a global citizenship course, and I think it's a valid perspective, and it's this idea of negotiation of what is an identity, and what is this shared history, and where does it come from, and how does it affect who we are. So I think that I completely get the other side of the perspective, that they are there because people identify with them and they don't want to let go of it, which is also I guess fine. But this concept of the fact that identity that's negotiated not just individually as we change through time, but also at a society level as new groups emerge, or you know, the say religious identity is replaced with community group belonging, or national identity is replaced with global citizenship belonging. This is a process. It's something that's dynamic, and I think that's a good way to both wrap up what we talked about and open up the discussion for this week.
Mm-hmm. I agree. I think it's a very thought-intriguing question, and I wish we had more time for it, but I think it's a great way for students to continue to explore and think about these questions. Yeah.
All right, so thank you everyone for your attention. Thank you, Alyssa, for joining us today. It was wonderful to hear your point of view. And thank you everyone for staying tuned and for all of your amazing questions. And I'm looking forward to weekly discussions and to seeing your assignments on the Learning Circle website. So thank you so much for this, and goodbye and good night.
Bye.